Hey folks, this is some quick tips for Copernicus, and today we're going to be looking at how we can create more interesting shapes. So let's jump in. So I'm going to start off with an SDF shape, and that's our go-to node for creating basic shapes. The first thing to note is that the values up here are used for the individual different shapes that you've got. The values down here are global. They'll be applied to all shapes. One of the things that you'll start to realize is that all the shapes go up to the edge, and usually you want to have a little bit of bleed around the edge. More often than not, I come in and I pull my uniform scale down here, down to about 0.7. And now if I change over to one of the other shapes, like diamond, instead of being at the edge, it has some padding around the outside. Often we will try and turn that into pixels, and we can use an SDF to mono to do that, and then go off and do all our compositing tricks. Usually we're trying to control the values on the inside here. We're trying to soften off the values on the inside, and then we're trying to soften off the values on the outside so we can get rid of these sharp edges. And we have a few different techniques for doing that. One of them is the feather, which basically acts like a bevel. We can increase the bevel amount here, and you'll see that we get this sort of beveled edge. You've got a few different options in terms of how sharp or soft that is, including one here for custom, which is kind of interesting. You can have it on any one particular side if you want to soften off a particular side of your shape. So if we go back to default, we can also feather towards the outside if we turn on feather from high to low. And now we're feathering from the original shape outwards to soften off that edge. So we're beveling outward. So that can be quite a handy node to use. Another way to do a somewhat similar thing is actually on the SDF to mono node itself. If I just go back here, under the shape at the moment, we're defining the shape as one constant value. We can actually change that over to ISO distance. And this will allow us to use a ramp to put different values inside in our shape. And ramps are quite nice to use in Houdini just more generally. So that can get you some interesting shapes there. If we want to start affecting the outside edges, we can play around with the ISO offset just here. You can see if I push that out, you see it's starting to get a kind of a softer shape towards the outside. So we're starting to get a more interesting looking shape overall. Now if I just put this back to default, another way to do something similar to that, if I just put this back to constant, is we can do the following. We can blur our edges. And what we can do is we can clamp the lower values. What we want to do is keep the very white values in here, but get rid of these gray values that we introduced with the blur. The way that we do that is we can increase the lower limit. Now you can see this is increasing the black values because it's saying replace with the limit value, but we can say replace with black. And now we can cut into that shape. We can soften it off. And if we increase the blur here, we can get different fall off shapes towards our edge. A variation on that kind of idea is that we can use a remap, which is basically your levels. And this gives us the advantage of having a ramp on it. We can come in and sort of play around with our shapes. And again, we can start to get more interesting values that are starting to fall off in different interesting ways. We could also do something similar with a threshold as opposed to a clamp, I guess, which is really a remap, but it's set to threshold rather than remap. And we can change the values here, and we can change the width values as well. So these techniques can be very useful for defining your edges. If I want to test those out, I can throw down my preview material and I can just hook them up to the height value. Now the height value by default is going to be quite large. So again, you can lower these, and I would suggest probably saving that as a default. You can see the edges are a little bit broken up here, and that's because I don't have enough dicing going on in my viewport. So if you hit D over your viewport, go to materials, and you change the level of detail up to 10, I have found that going higher than 10 doesn't get you any more detailing, but you can see that will get me a much cleaner displacement overall or tessellation. At the moment, saving as default doesn't really seem to work for me all that well in 20.5.278. I have to do that each time, which is a slight bit annoying. So that gives me a much cleaner edge here, and now I can go and start playing around with my values. I think you'll be surprised at the amount of control you get over your beveled edges. Another way to get interesting shapes is to take advantage of our SDFs before we turn them into pixels. So I'm just going to copy my SDF shape here. I'll copy it twice. I'm going to add some thickness to the line. I'll make the line a little bit longer here. Before we go and turn our SDF into some pixels, we can use an FDS blend, and this will allow us to do some SDF booleans. I'm going to just change this over to subtract. I get these various options for the kind of fillet that I want, and you can get some interesting looking shapes out of this. So maybe if I Just start to rotate this around a little bit. Yeah, we start to get some interesting shapes out of this. And then of course I can go from back over to SDF to mono, over like that. And now I start to get what feel a little bit more like kind of sci-fi shapes, I guess. Or maybe some branding or insignia type shapes. If I go to my mono, maybe if I give it just a little bit of a bevel edge, let's flip it the other way and lower it down a little bit, just so we get that kind of ever so slight beveled edge there. And then I could maybe mirror that, and maybe I can go from a mono to RGB. Now, at the moment, there isn't a way to do a color lookup, so this is the best way I found to do this. So we get this ramp over here, and we start to get these interesting shapes. And we can go back and change our various types of fillets to get different looks to our edges. I hope you found those quick tips useful, and I'll see you in the next video.